On the 6th of February, 1958, a football team boarded a plane in Munich for what should have been a routine refueling stop. They were the best team English football had ever produced, and most of them, within minutes, would be dead. This isn't just the story of a plane crash. It's the story of a manager who built something extraordinary, watched it die in the snow, and then somehow built it again. Some of the players on that plane were barely old enough to vote. One of them was, by near universal agreement, on his way to becoming the greatest footballer England had ever produced. He would never play again. To understand what was lost at Munich, you have to understand what Matt Busby built. In the early 1950s, Busby did something no English manager had really dared to do. He threw out his experienced, proven players and replaced them with teenagers. Kids, some as young as 16, straight out of Manchester United's youth system. At the time, this was considered reckless. English football in the 1950s ran on experience. Clubs didn't hand first-team shirts to boys who still had schoolwork to finish. The press mocked them at first. They called them Busby Babes, as an insult, a joke about a manager who'd apparently lost his nerve. Then the Babes started winning. Not just winning, dominating. They won the English League title in 1956, and again in 1957. By the age of 18 or 20, players like Duncan Edwards were already being talked about as the best footballers in the world, not just in England. Bobby Charlton, one of the youngest in the squad, later said that walking into that dressing room felt less like joining a football team and more like joining a family that happened to be extraordinarily good at football. By early 1958, this wasn't a promising young team anymore. It was, by most reasonable measures, the best team in the country, and one of the best in Europe. There was one thing Busby wanted more than anything, and the English football establishment actively tried to stop him from getting it. The European Cup was brand new, only in its second year, and the Football League actually banned English champions from entering it. They saw it as a distraction from the domestic season, an unnecessary risk with no real reward. Busby ignored them anyway and entered his team regardless, one of the first real acts of defiance that would define his legacy. It worked. United reached the semi-finals in their first European campaign and were back again the following year, chasing it further. By February 1958, the Babes were through to the quarter-finals, and they just fought out a brutal away leg in Belgrade, Yugoslavia. A match United needed to survive rather than dominate, drawing 3-3 to advance 5-4 on aggregate. The mood on the return flight was, by every surviving account, one of the happiest of the entire season. They'd done it. They were through to the semi-final of Europe's biggest club competition, with a squad still young enough to do this for another decade. The plane couldn't fly directly from Belgrade to Manchester. The aircraft, a British European Airways Elizabethan-class propeller plane, needed to refuel part-way. So it stopped in Munich, West Germany. It had been snowing in Munich all day. When the aircraft first tried to take off after refueling, the pilots aborted the attempt because of an engine problem. They tried again minutes later, aborted again. Passengers were told to disembark and wait in the terminal while the crew worked out what was wrong. Some players, uneasy about flying in that weather after 2 failed attempts, reportedly discussed getting a train the rest of the way instead. They didn't. Captain James Tarn and co-pilot Kenneth Raymond decided conditions were acceptable for a 3rd attempt. Everyone reboarded. It was just after 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The runway was covered in slush, a mix of melting snow and standing water that the crew had no reliable way to judge from inside the cockpit. As the plane accelerated for its 3rd takeoff attempt, it never reached the speed it needed to lift off. It ran off the end of the runway, crossed a perimeter road, and struck a house and a fuel hut just beyond the airfield. The aircraft broke apart on impact. 23 of the 44 people on board died, either instantly or in the hours and days that followed in hospital. Among them, 8 of Busby's players. Roger Byrne, the team captain, Tommy Taylor, Jeff Bent, Eddie Coleman, Mark Jones, David Pegg, Liam Whelan. each of them under 30 years old. And then, a fortnight later, the man many inside and outside the club considered the most talented of them all. Duncan Edwards fought for 15 days in a Munich hospital before he died. He was 21. Busby himself was pulled from the wreckage with catastrophic chest and lung injuries. Twice in the hospital, doctors believed he was close enough to death that a priest was called to administer last rites. Twice, he survived. News of the crash reached Manchester before most of the details were even confirmed. Crowds gathered outside Old Trafford in silence, waiting for information that, for several families, would never come the way they were hoping. Journalists died too. 8 of the 23 killed were sports writers who had covered the Babes since they were teenagers, some of them close enough to the players to be considered almost part of the squad. An entire generation of English football writing was wiped out in the same instant as the team it had spent years writing about. For most football clubs, even a terrible season is just a bad year that gets forgotten. This wasn't that. For Manchester United in February 1958, this was closer to an extinction event, a club that had to figure out, almost overnight, whether it even had a future. United had a match to play just 13 days later. An FA Cup tie the club was still technically obligated to fulfill, disaster or not. Busby, still in a Munich hospital bed fighting for his own life, wasn't there to pick the team. His assistant, Jimmy Murphy, pieced together, aside from reserves, teenagers who'd barely trained with the first team, and emergency signings made in the days beforehand. Manchester United won that match 3-0. People who were in the stadium that night have described it less like watching a football match and more like attending a wake. A stadium full of people cheering through tears for a team that barely resembled the one they had watched 2 weeks earlier. 2 of the biggest names to walk away from the wreckage were Bobby Charlton, then just 20 years old, and goalkeeper Harry Gregg, who, badly shaken himself, ran back into the burning wreckage of the plane to pull a mother and her baby daughter to safety before anyone else on the scene had moved. Both men would go on to define what came next for this club, in very different ways. Busby recovered, and against the direct advice of doctors who told him his football career, and perhaps his life, depended on stepping away, he went back to work rebuilding the club from almost nothing. It took 10 years. 10 years of new signings, new academy graduates coming through the same youth system that had produced the Babes, and a manager who had buried 8 of his own players and somehow found a way to keep going anyway. In 1968, Manchester United became the first English club to win the European Cup. The very trophy the Babes had been flying home from, chasing a decade earlier, when their plane went down on a snow-covered runway in Munich. Bobby Charlton, who had survived Munich as a 20-year-old with visible scars from the crash, lifted the trophy that night as captain. Matt Busby, watching from the touchline, was seen in tears before the final whistle had even sounded. It wasn't a happy ending. Nothing about Munich has one, and nothing ever really could. But it was, at least, an answer to the only question that mattered afterward: whether what Busby had built could survive, even after it had already died once. 8 players never came home from Munich. But in a strange way, none of them ever really left Old Trafford either.
If this story moved you, hit subscribe. There are more forgotten chapters of football history waiting to be told. This has been Footnote. Thanks for watching.